it was because of those stories that throughout time we found the strength to do those in those kinds of moments. We've been able to look to those stories to draw strength, right? To do those things, to become who we are, even if that's doing something that seems totally to the reasonable, logical mind is a totally crazy thing to do. But it was so important that you did the crazy thing, that hero did the crazy thing.
This is Way of the Artist with Brandon Colby Cook and Evan Schulte.
Exploring the challenges of the creative call
so that you can claim your own path
and make your life a work of art.
Well, everybody, we're back with Way of the Artist podcast, and I'm excited for this conversation, Brandon. I mean, I'm always excited for our conversations, but I'm especially excited for this one. I mean, who knows where it'll go, but at the outset, I'm feeling good. So we're calling this one The Reality of Myth. And this came out of a conversation that we had, I don't know, how many days back? I don't know, like 4 or 5 days ago, something like that. And it started off in a sense, I'll try and give like the rundown. I feel like the context I think might be good for everybody on this one. So there's this saying that goes something like this from the acting teacher Sanford Meisner, and he said, the theater is not an imitation of life. It demands an even greater truth. And that has a lot to do with this conversation that we're having, because he's talking to, at least in my mind, he's talking to how art and story, and as we're getting into myth, how it plays a certain kind of role in human life, in that we use these mediums as a means of talking about and expressing and getting into these realities of life, these invisible realities of life that we can only talk about through these kinds of mediums. And that in so many ways, those things are more real than the reality that we typically sort of live by, or what we see. So I'm excited to just get into a conversation about myth. I feel like that's something that's becoming more important for me, something that I'm definitely finding a lot of inspiration and focus on, and it's showing me a lot of things. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the basic background to, where this conversation is coming from. Brandon, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, well, I'm excited about this one as well, man. It does feel like one of those conversations where there'll be stuff left on the table at the end of this, because I feel like it's such a big thing to explore, because we're gonna get into story to some degree, I'm sure, and and then you go down that road, and then there's so many things. And for me, story is such an important part of my life. It's just, it's something I've been on kind of a pursuit. I've been after it since I was a teenager. I mean, just, not just understanding story, but the desire to like know what makes a good story and why a story is great and how to do it myself. And, the thing is, in the pursuit of story, I've also found that you ultimately end up having to look at your own life as the textbook of answers is kind of within you. And yet you're using myth and these elements of story, and they're all just kind of techniques and ideas until you dig into yourself and then you pull them out. So anyway, I mean, one thing that I'm interested in maybe kicking off with, and I'll throw this out right away, is we were talking about, so I was doing some research this week, and I've been building a class on story and stuff. And as Evan and I were talking about this, I decided I would do a bit of research on myth and whatnot. And, there's this one thing that I don't always talk about. And I realized we should put more focus on this. This is a big part of story. When I talk about with my students about story, I always not talk about the flawed character and how important that is. And you need a flaw. And if they're too perfect, you create what I call the Superman syndrome, which is where you have a character that is unrelatable and then has nowhere to go. There's no arc, there's no change. But another interesting element kind of relates to flaw, but not explicitly, is the reluctant hero. And, I'm sure you've heard of this before. And if you haven't, well, we're going to explore it. But the reluctance of the hero is a very interesting element. It was something that I was like, yeah, this is such an important part of the myth, of the journey. If you have a character that isn't reluctant, and I'll let you share more of this because Evan put out some big thoughts, some thoughts that really resonated with me is like, you don't really trust the person that isn't reluctant, the person that's just like too gung-ho. It's like, well, the reluctance actually kind of is more relatable, and reluctance is related to fear, and it's also related to the shadow. And there's a certain element which is truthful about that, because I think we can all relate to the desire to stay comfortable, and we don't necessarily like change. We don't, change is inevitable. It's going to happen in life, especially if you push yourself towards goals and aspirations, or you have to show up for something that's difficult. Change is necessary, but we don't pursue change. Most of us don't until we realize something's wrong. Like sometimes I will pursue change, but I only pursue change when I realize, hey, I need to change. Something is not working and I'm starting to feel the pain of it not working. So I actively go after change, but I'm reluctant to change it first because I think maybe I can stay the way I am and still get what I want. And then eventually I realize, no, I'm going to have to change. And I think story captures this myth in all heroes. And it's such an interesting thing for us to explore. So anyway, the reluctant hero and the reluctance of myth and the reluctance of going on the journey. I think this also relates, I'll pair one last thing before I pass it over. In Way of the Artist, we talk about, finding your way and claiming your path and embracing your path and all of that. But we have to suspect that there is a reluctance for you to do that. And that's honest and it's real because there's something to do with it's scary to step out on your own and carve your own path and trailblaze and, even sometimes to follow a path that someone else did that you maybe don't feel like you can match up to or live up to. And reluctance, I think what I want to start this podcast with is that even when you have these big goals, it's human to be reluctant to go after them. It's human to have fear and to not feel good enough and all of that stuff. And I think that's why myth requires that, because that's one of the first major touch points of journey is that we have to first face our fear and our reluctance to even go on the journey at all.
Yeah, because there's something in, like, typically the story is because there's something bigger that's being asked, something that's bigger than ourselves, and it pushes up against many things. It can push up against our sense of identity, or pushes into our fears. It pushes us into an unknown space. And so, yeah, there's that reluctance to do it. And as you're saying, that whole aspect of, the reluctant hero, but also there's I think, there's also the myth of the unreluctant hero. Unreluctant, is that a word? But it's the one who isn't, and as you're saying, like, there's something about that we are a bit, I think, suspicious of, when we see that in the story, and typically it means that they have just yet to run into that thing. And it didn't occur to me in our pre-chat, but just as you were talking now, I was thinking of what came to mind was All Quiet on the Western Front, which, I mean, look, it's based on a true story and true events, but there's absolutely mythic elements in the storytelling of this thing, because, I mean, war is one of the biggest subjects of myth, because of how powerful of an event it is, how shaking of an event it is for the people who are not just in it, but the people who live during those times, right? Particularly in the First World War, right, where it takes place. But like in the book, but also in the fantastic new movie adaptation of it, and you see the beginning of it where you have all of these young guys just like they're so psyched to go to war and fight for the fatherland and all of this stuff, and it's like there's no reluctance to what they're doing, right? And they fucking get out there, and it's just like suddenly it's like they're faced with the reality of what's going on, right? And there's a complete shift in who they are, and I mean it's a tragic story, and I think that's often how that story goes. It often ends in a tragedy. I think not necessarily, because there's also the story of the person who goes out with, like, yes, I'm ready to be this thing, and then they hit the excuse me, and then they confront the shadow, they confront the challenge, they suddenly are confronted with some part of themselves, something that they didn't expect, something, and now they run into the reluctance within themselves. Like, I didn't really actually understand what this entailed, and I don't know if I can do this. Right. And then wherever the story goes from there. So, I mean, I love that you brought in this, when you said that, and just as someone who has studied, and written many stories, but also studied the mechanics of story as much as you have, and you just having this discovery for yourself, not that was something you were unfamiliar with, but just the power and the importance of that aspect of it, right? Like it's a huge one, because in the mythic element, it's almost, I don't know, maybe it's essential. Like whether the person has it at the beginning or doesn't, there's something I think that you have to be very conscientious about when it comes to that element, because it plays such an important role in who that person is at that point in time. What are their fears? What are their desires? What are their weaknesses? What are their flaws? It says so many, you talk a lot about flaw in character. And I mean, reluctance says a lot about what their potential flaws could be, right? And I mean, coming back into just a general conversation about myth, it's not just because, oh yes, these are just components that make up a good story. These things are supposed to be deeply reflective to us as its audience. These are things that are supposed to shake us deeply, to show us something about ourselves and say like, hey, what are the things that life is asking of you, right? That your situation is asking of you, the calling that we often talk about, that maybe you're ignoring, that maybe you're afraid to go towards, right? And or you're reluctant to go towards that thing, right? But it is towards that thing that you have to go, right? And I think also that reluctance, I'm speaking a lot, but let me throw one more element into this in terms of the mythic structure, is that there's this quality of leaving home that is very often in all of the great myths. You have to leave the comforts of where you are from on some level. And you see that, and it doesn't necessarily mean literally like, the person's house, but it's home is that place where things are safe and easy and comfortable. But in order to become fully human, to become who you are supposed to be, requires you to leave that place. And so it's only natural that there's that reluctance that comes with it. So just throwing that in the ring.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of interesting things. Okay, one thing that I just want to mention this before I forget. Implication. It's the implication of not being unreluctant. I don't know if that's a word either. But the implication of that, and I think you use All Quiet on the Western Front is a great example of that, and there are other stories a lot related to war that are like that, where you got the young soldier who's ready to get out there and have the good fight and has no idea what they're getting into. And then, they either come back like post-traumatic stress, traumatized, whatever. And, and there's something relatable about that story. This is kind of like the loss of innocence, and I think there is a myth in the loss of innocence and the implications of being without reluctance might mean that you are innocent, and that you don't really know what you're signing up for. You don't really know the journey that you're about to go on. And I think that regardless of if the character is reluctant or not reluctant, there are implications either way that need to be honored by myth. And there's something true about that we all resonate with, where when someone is not reluctant, those of us who know go, oh boy, okay, good luck, Like someone says, I want to be an actor. And you're like, okay. And those experienced actors go, okay, good luck. I hope you can hang in there, because you're in for a fine ride. But at the same time, that lack of reluctance, that willingness to go out for it and do it is a beautiful thing. And innocence can provide that ability for you to leap without really looking, quality, which sometimes we need a hero to have. We need someone to just be like, I'll jump in. I don't know what I'm getting into, but I'll jump in. And then they live up to it, but we need to honor if they knew what they were getting into, they might not have leaped so blindly, And so in some ways we can launch a character into a story. We can launch ourselves into a story, and if we find ourselves without reluctance, we might be like, okay, well, maybe the humility is, I don't know what I'm getting into, but, I suppose I'll find out, but I want to do this and I'm going to go for it. I think the reluctant hero is an interesting thing because, as you pointed out in our pre-talk, Evan, the reluctant hero has some kind of self-awareness that the unreluctant hero doesn't. They know something about themselves and about the world that is causing them to resist the call, which is another part of myth, the call. Something calls, and look at the artist. What's your calling, right? It's like, why are you resisting your calling, right? But in a story, it's the call to action, the call to do something. And I often talk about this in a story, the inciting incident, the event that happens outside of you that incites action and forces your hand. It doesn't matter how reluctant you are. You decide my values are higher than my reluctance. And so even though I'm reluctant, I must do what I must do. And, it doesn't matter how I feel. It doesn't matter that I'm scared. It doesn't matter that I don't think I'm good enough. I'm going to give it a shot because some things are worth dying for. Some things are worth going for. But something we talked about, and I think this is an interesting element for us to parlay into, is the shadow. And this is another big discovery that I had, which was that the antagonist or the antagonistic force in your story is interlinked with the main character, the protagonist or the hero, because it has something to do with their shadow. And the shadow, is a little bit, it's not, I don't think you can define it necessarily in one thing, but it has a lot to do with your fear or maybe your dark side. Maybe it has something to do with your flaw. But going and answering the call requires us to face our shadow, which is something we may spend our entire life avoiding. And the shadow is in some ways a reflection of the antagonist. So if you have a physical antagonist, like an actual person, they somehow embody some part of you that you avoid and deny in yourself and don't like about yourself. And that's actually part of what makes a great story, because by facing the antagonist, you actually have to face your shadow, which is like, what's more fucking mythical than that? You know what I mean? That this darkness in you is the very thing you're trying to overcome that's been manifest in the world. And so you look at these people who go, well, you know, these people are bad and I hate this and whatever. It's like, yeah, because that's your shadow. You may be unaware that this is inside of you, but the very things you hate are usually a mirror, not usually, they're always somehow a mirror reflection of what's inside of you that either you are unaware of and deny, or you're aware of and you see. And it's okay to root out bad things in the external world, but understand that as you root out that in the world, you're also on a journey to root it out of yourself. And myth has this parallel. It's always going on. We talk about this in story all the time. What's the external struggle and the internal struggle? And most new storytellers will miss the internal struggle. The external struggle is very easy. Oh, it's a bad guy. I'm going to beat him up and, you know, whatever. We got to stop him from launching the bomb or something, right? But it's like, yeah, but how does that character reflect what's in your main character? How do they show the thing? So a great example would be Batman and the Joker. The Joker is the ideal reflection of Batman. And, you know, often people are more interested in the Joker than they are in Batman. Part of it is because, like, the Dark Knight, you know, as he's called, is his shadow. But his shadow, and the whole thing about Batman is like, Batman doesn't kill. Like, that's kind of whatever. I don't know if that'll change one day, but whatever. That's kind of part of the myth of him, right? Of this iconic character. And then you got the Joker, who's this kind of chaos and this darkness and this destruction. But Batman is that. And anyway, Evan, I don't want to go too far off the rails. I just want to kind of parlay into this whole the shadow, because I think the reluctance has a lot to do with we don't want to face our shadow. We don't want to admit our shadow. We don't want to acknowledge it. But the hero's journey is very much about acknowledging the shadow.
Yeah, I think this is a lot. You know, some of our last podcast that we did about creating beyond the divisive. I mean, I think that's part of that whole deep mythic quality, the wisdom of mythic storytelling, is because it's aware and it makes that connection. It's like, oh no, hey, this villain is not just some outside thing. This villain is a reflection of, as you said, of that shadow and maybe that reluctance of the hero, right? They're just like this manifestation, right? They're just like a physical or whatever manifestation of that internal thing. And it continues, so it keeps that connection, right? We're saying it's like, no, this we're not cut off from these types of people, you know, like we are actually deeply connected to these people. They didn't just spring out on their own out of nothing. They came from the same world that we come from, you know. And you know, you bring up Batman and Joker is such a great sort of more modern, iconic, mythic version of that, because yeah, like, you know, the Joker is you know, especially with a lot of the interpretations of him, he's this chaos creator, right? This violent chaos creator. And in so many ways, that's a reflection of Batman, you know, of Bruce Wayne, because Bruce Wayne's an outlaw. When you actually think about it, Bruce, you know, he's maybe not a criminal in the strictest sense, but he's certainly an outlaw in the sense that he's breaking laws, right? Like he's doing things, but he's doing it out of his own sense of doing what's right and doing what he feels is needed. But that violent chaos is in him. That capacity to do really bad things is in him. And, you know, a lot of the stories around that character reflect that. They show and they navigate that tightrope that he has to walk in terms of whether he becomes like the criminals himself. And it's just because it's really just a few things that separate him from the guys that he's trying to shut down. And that's sort of his life, his journey, because he's filled with rage. You know, like Batman is a rage-filled hero. Mm-hmm. And it's something that he has to learn how to deal with and channel into the right places. And so yeah, that's I love that you brought that character into, because he is a fantastic example.
Okay, so something about Batman, which I think is just coming up for me as we're talking, is he is rage-filled because his parents were killed by, you know, a criminal, and he had to live without them and grew up essentially, you know, with Alfred as like this butler who's kind of like raising him and become his mentor. And, you know, you think about that, like just think about his struggle, right? Like someone comes along and just kills your parents while you're a child for like some spare change. And you become this, you're this wealthy, powerful person. You go, you know, I want to fucking get the person that did that to me. And that's a lot of the reason what drives Batman. The thing that makes Batman good is his resistance to killing. Because if you think about it, the thing that makes a character good versus bad is that they won't do the things that the bad character will do, which handcuffs them to some degree and gives the antagonist or the bad guy more power, because the bad guys are willing to do things that the good guys aren't willing to do. And that's part of the reason why they have the advantage. But if you believe in good and you want good in the world, and that's really truly what you're fighting for, then you will be okay with the handcuffs that you have. And, you know, you can look at it as like, you know, Batman, just give me an example, comes across somebody mugging some old woman, and he could kill that person and just be like, don't want that person around anymore. And the whole thing is that he doesn't. I mean, that line between being bad and being good is so thin. And that's part of the reason why we don't like, it's illegal to be a vigilante in our world. You know, but we will hear stories of vigilantes, how vigilantes went after bad people and fucking did them in. And there's a certain part of us as humanity that's like, yeah, fucking got that person. Like, fuck them, you know? But there's also a certain element of like, yeah, but if we just let the world do that, if you can just go out and like kill somebody because they quote unquote did something wrong or bad, like first it starts off with really bad stuff. But where does that slippery slope end up? You know, all of a sudden someone's just done something minor, and then someone can go out and just totally obliterate their life, you know, like, and it's tolerated. Like, we could very easily slip into chaos and the Wild West, a really bad situation, right? And this is the thing is like, I think ultimately with myth, one of the core fucking ingredients is good and bad. We're always fucking trying to investigate that. And, you know, I mean, haven't you been watching a show and the good guy has the bad guy pinned, and we're like, you know, I've had this moment. I mean, I don't know if everyone else has had it, but definitely with like 80s and 90s movies and stuff, it was like, just fucking kill him. Just fucking eliminate him. Then you don't have to worry about him anymore. And the character won't, and you're almost frustrated that they won't, because you know that maybe that person might come back and like it haunts them somehow. Yeah. But like that line, we have to draw a line. If you really truly want good in the world, we have to have boundary. We have to draw a line. And, you know, and even though it's easier to do the bad thing, that's where good exists. Good exists because it somehow manages to try to not do the easy thing, which is where bad becomes really fucking bad, you know? But anyway, I mean, the shadow is interesting because I think the shadow is a very much a reflection of the ego, whereas the ego wants destruction and it's justified. And I think we need to, myth teaches us a lot about our justifications, and it teaches us a lot about our shadow, because it makes us look at it and go like, just because this would be easier and just because you want this doesn't mean you should do it. And just because you can doesn't mean you should. And, I truly believe, and something I've definitely experienced and explored a lot over the last, several years, is where does bad actually find ground? And I've concluded that usually bad exists in the realm of what's easier. Usually, in most cases, you can track it back to it was just easier to do the bad thing. And the justification is that I'll only do it the one time. I think it's Jordan Belfort. I think that's his name, who is the guy who the story of Wolf on Wall Street is about. Yeah. He shares a story, which I think is interesting, where he talks about how he could sell a stock for, I don't know, a 6-cent stock for 2 cents or whatever, something like that, or 2-cent stock for 6 cents. I forget how it works, and he would get like essentially $1 million, like a bag of cash, $1 million. And the first time he was confronted with this idea, he was like, he's like, okay, well, I'll just do it the once, then I'll be set up. And he said, and the problem is that you do it the once and it's easier to do it the second time. And all of a sudden you're doing it the second and the third. And then all of a sudden, you're who I am and you fucked everybody over. And he says that he's, trying to repair the damages he's done in the world. But that guy created a tremendous amount of damage in people's lives in the world. Like almost to the point where irredeemable, you know what I mean? And as humanity, we navigate that there are people like this that exist. But if we look at him like just a villain and say, oh, he's just out to get everyone and he just wanted to fuck everyone over, he didn't. He was self-serving, and it was easier to self-serve, and he justified it by it was one time he was going to do it. And then it became easier to do the second and easier to do the second. And that's where bad shit happens. It just happens because it just becomes easier and your conscience slowly gets killed off. Final note, if Batman kills somebody, it's easier to kill the next person. It's easier to kill the next person. It's easier to kill the next person. And then all of a sudden, you're the murderer, right? And then you need a vigilante to come after you. Because what if, the other thing too is, what if he makes the wrong call? What if he kills an innocent thinking they're bad? Doesn't that tarnish him forever? And you go, maybe not. You go, well, what if that was your brother, your sister, your mother, your wife, your husband, your child, that this Batman, this hero came and killed because they thought they were bad and he was misinformed and he didn't know? Well, I think you'd fucking hate him, and I think you'd want to kill Batman, and that might turn you into the Joker.
Yeah. And I mean, like there's something that you say we talking about Jordan Belfort. Oh yeah, it's in like his story, because it's in many ways very easy to sit there and for us to sit and condemn the decisions that he made, but I think part of, again, if you're seeking out that mythic quality to his story, I mean, I start to go down the direction of, well, if I was in that position where, like, man, this amount of money was just there kind of for the taking, like you hope that you would have enough of a spine to not do the things that's going to really destroy other people, but there's this, again, this reflection of his type, like especially you want to talk about archetypes, which is something that, I don't have a lot of expertise in. It's something that I'm interested in learning more about. But if you look at sort of his sort of as an archetype, like there's something about him and in his time and in his place, and we can see it as a reflection of our society that is so focused on status and wealth and image and all of these things that doing these things afforded him, right? Like it's really not so hard to see how somebody goes down that path, and for us to ask ourselves, truly, how, like, would we have done any different in his position? I think in many ways that's like the important thing for us to be asking when we watch that story, not just as saying like, oh man, look at what this guy did. No, hang on a second. How is actually he like you? How is, and especially because if you look, the book or the movie or whatever, he's both, like I'm trying to think of who would the antagonist actually really be in that story. It's like he's almost his own antagonist in the whole situation, his own greed, his own pride and stubbornness and hubris. All of those things are in so many ways the thing that does him in by the end of it all. But he's just such a reflection of his culture and of his time. And how do we all, in our own ways, maybe on a much, much smaller level, how do we kind of act the same way? Right? Just how do we, in our own way, are we just kind of seeking our own, pleasure, like just fueling our own greed? How often do we make bad decisions, maybe in the sense of compromising our relationships with our friends, our family, whatever it is, so that we can chase a few more dollars down, kind of a thing. All of these things that in our own way, we're doing the same thing. So it's like, again, I think that this is, coming back to the power of coming back to myth, which, again, is one of the reasons why I think that I'm so interested in it, and why on many levels I feel like we've been talking about it more recently, is because there's so much power to it that seems to be lacking in so much of our storytelling, which is, not to go over too much ground that we've actually covered a lot of in interesting little ways over the last number of podcasts. But, there's there can be just a shallowness and an emptiness in terms of just, let's create content. There's something that's entertaining, kind of just checking boxes of a story should have this and it should have that. And getting back to that quality of myth, which is it's there to strip you in so many ways. Like a great story strips you down, it rocks you a little bit, it changes you, it shakes you up, slaps you across the face, punches you in the chest, like how all of these things, like it's myth has a disruptive, disturbing quality to it. And not, I mean, disturbing as in like necessarily grotesque, even though a lot of myths do have grotesque elements to them, it's always in service of trying to communicate something really, really freaking deep, and in a way that can almost be confusing as well. I think that's another quality of myth, is that you've really got to sit with them, and in many ways you continue to come back to them, and you find new things in it. They change, and as you change and as you grow and get older and all of these things, they have such a profound level of depth to them in how they understand and connect to humanity, which, humanity is a word that we haven't brought into it, but you were saying some interesting things about our, humanity before we started recording. Do you remember some of what you were saying there? I'm trying to remember some of what you were saying with that, and I was like, oh, you had some really great points to say about all of that. But like it's I mean, myth is so deeply connected to our humanity, and it's not so much caught up in political kinds of conversations. It's cutting through a lot of those things.
Yeah, I don't know. We talked about a lot of stuff, and it's hard for me to remember at the moment. Okay, well, maybe I'll think about it. Maybe it'll come back during this conversation. I hope it does. Something that we're kind of after in this conversation, which just kind of dawned on me, is like, okay, I think we've just discussed some of these interesting elements that brought us here. The shadow, the reluctance and whatnot, but the truth, there's something about the myth of story which tells a truth that is almost inaccessible without it. And, I'm thinking about this, and I'm like, I think because there's a certain element to quote unquote reality that's very much complacent, and we're not pushed, we're not pressured. We have all these ways of distracting ourselves and not facing our fears and our insecurities. And we have ways of bolstering our ego to make us, have an image of having it together. And, and we're just trying to get by. And I think there's something fucking so human about that. And I don't think anybody should feel bad about that. I think it's something we all do. And I think it's totally natural. And there is a certain amount of life, which is, I just need to survive the day, the week, the month, the year, the decade, the whatever, my life. There is an element which is very real, like very much the reality of, I just need to fucking function, pay my bills, feed myself, keep some shelter, not have everyone fucking hate me, figure out how to have some friends and some connections that are real and not a bunch of bullshit where everyone's just using me. Because we know there are users and all sorts of, fucked up people out there, and we're just trying to find our tribe and navigate it and not be hurt and whatever. And I think that this is an element that's always at play. And sometimes we have it managed and sometimes we don't. And when we don't have it managed, our life's very much just about, let me get through the day, let me survive, let me fucking figure out how I'm going to pay the bills this month and whatever. And I think we can come and visit that place, and we can leave that place and come back to it. And then there's the element of where myth takes us outside of our own world. And something that's kind of coming up for me is, one of the things that myth does in story, but myth in story does, is it shows us an interconnectedness that we know is true, but we don't always want to see. For example, the relationship to our shadow, and, Jordan Belfort and all that bit we went into about how there's a part of him in all of us that we don't like to admit. And it's easier for us to sometimes go, that guy's a bad guy and he's horrible, and like we should get rid of people like him in the world. And it's like, yeah, but if you are him, do you still agree? And it's like, well, no. So my way to maintain that story, that false narrative, is to pretend that I am not like him, and that we are different, and that he is an anomaly, and that, this is just not anything to do with me. And myth goes, actually, you are more intertwined with the antagonistic hate that you have than you think. And that's the truth that we don't always like to see. But the truth is what makes a kind of cohesive self-awareness. It's what brings humanity together. And it's also what makes us actually aware. And it actually gives us access to our greatest superpower, which is, our gifts, right? Because the thing is, if you sit on a high horse in a pedestal and you just exist as I'm perfect, I do no wrong, and there's nothing, no shadow in me, then you're gonna just look at everybody who exemplifies the shadow, and you're just gonna go, well, they're all bad, and I'm the one that has it figured out. And I think this is part of the problem with media today. People take that position, and then they go, I'm gonna tell you how to be. I'm going to show you where the power should be. I'm going to show you what's wrong with the world, and I'm going to sit on my high horse, and you don't see it, but I do, and I'm going to show it to you through my media, through my story, through my movie, or through whatever. And we're all like, that's bullshit, And there's a certain amount of people that go along with it because they're sitting in that same kind of seat you're sitting in, and they go, yeah, I agree with it, but it's bullshit. It's not real. And I think something about, tribalism is that you can have a tribe that's a fucking bad, fucking evil tribe, but they think they're good, and they think they're fighting the good fight. And that's a slippery slope too. Whereas, the whole tribalism of we're right and you're all wrong, and we can kind of kill you because we're the righteous ones. That's a fucking dangerous fucking death cult. You know what I mean? That's a fucking bad group. And you can slip into not just your own badness in yourself, you can slip into your badness with your group because you start agreeing with everything they say, and you start thinking, yeah, they're right. Look at the Nazis. Everybody likes to go, oh, the Nazis are bad. You're a Nazi, Nazi, Nazi. It's like, okay, but try to understand how those kids went down that fucking road. They were just good, innocent kids who were told a narrative about how somebody was fucking them over, and somebody was hurting their family and hurting their culture, and how the whole world was putting their foot on them, and they needed to step up and become. And so they were indoctrinated in this cult of Nazism. Like they were kids, they were 7 years old. And then all of a sudden they're 15 and they're fighting in a war as Nazi youth. And and they were just kids that wanted to go to the park. And to go to the park, you had to agree with the Nazi party, and you were only 7 years old. You didn't know what you were agreeing to. The point is that if we can look at the Nazis and we say, oh, Nazis are bad. And I agree. What they did was fucked. I'm not defending them in any form. But I'm saying that we need to see how that slope by a good person goes down that road, that they were not bad fucking apples in the beginning. Some of them probably were, but that's going to happen in every group. But good kids who loved, who just wanted, to stand up for their family and their tribe and their community, got sucked down a road of being fucking the worst atrocity of humanity that, we often reference today, which I'm sure they're even worse than that. But that happened, right? And I think the thing is like myth sometimes brings a truth that lets us see that we're not as different as we think. And I don't think we always like that truth. But when it's done well and it's not preachy, we that's the slap in the face. That's the punch in the chest you're talking about, where it's like, oh, fuck. I can see it now. And I think what myth does in a way is it can be transformative in that it can get us to remove hate and divisiveness. Because, I do think there is something about myth, which is like, I think in our hearts, we do want good to reside. We want good to win. But I think in some ways, for us to actually achieve that goal that we're after, we have to also see the shadow and the darkness, so that it becomes a process of not just rooting it out in the world, but rooting it out in ourselves. Because remember that it came out of us. We are, all the narcissism that's going on in the world right now is a product of our fucked up values in our culture. It's, and it's, I'm not saying narcissists are good, and like, I'd fucking prefer if they weren't around to some degree, but we have to understand that narcissism was it's embraced by our culture. And that's why they say, well, not everybody's a narcissist, but people have narcissistic tendencies. We have tendencies because we've let a certain amount of, hey, I'm going to take care of me flourish. And I don't care that my phone was made by slaves in some other country. I'm not going to think about that. Yet at the same time, I'm be a hypocrite and say, hey, we shouldn't have this in the world. And yet it's like, yeah, but you're participating in the whole fucking thing. And we have to make our peace with that. And that's not easy. The truth is fucking brutal. Because once we start to see the interconnectedness of it, it can be, but it can be beautiful. It can be beautiful. It's beautiful and brutal all at the same time. Anyway, myth, I think, it on many levels tethers certain things, the brutal and the beautiful together. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. Oh man, you said a lot of things there. I kind of don't know where to jump in.
Beautiful and the brutal.
Well, I mean, yeah, the truth thing is, like that. I think that's a big word that you brought into this whole thing, like coming back to that whole thing, like the reality of myth. Like that's what myth does, is like that. The reality is it's bringing a truth. It's bringing a truth that isn't, something that you can like touch with your hands. It's telling you something that's almost, it's in the fabric of nature itself, and making you aware of that thing. And, those invisible things are often, they're hard things to wrestle with. They're hard things to tango with, which is why we have story, because they actually help us find a way of entering into a space with them and grasping them at some level, which is interesting because some people like to just, especially in today's day and age, lots of people just are far more comfortable just to completely do without, and because there's something so challenging about myths, in the way that they challenge us and our perceptions of things, that so many of us have just decided to ignore them, and it's like, let's just deal with objective reality because it's simpler. Even though there's a lot of complex things to understand in that space, in a weird way, it's like, it's less scary, but you can't ignore it. Like you can't ignore those invisible things just because they make you uncomfortable. But I think that's, great myth makes it all approachable, like a good story. And then we can just nod our heads and go like, oh yeah. Like it just can hit us in a certain place where we can deepen our relationship to and with life and with ourselves. One thing I wanted to bring into this conversation, because I know for me, this person has been a fairly influential in my life more recently, like this year especially, is a guy by the name of Martin Shaw. And he's a storyteller, author, speaker, teacher, all of these things, and who's very much within, his ground is in the land of myth. And I'm nowhere, I won't even compare myself in the same understanding of myth as him, but there's something that he said that I thought would be good to bring in here. And it was this comment he made about how in our time right now, most of us are living like 1 foot in front of our faces, and both literally and figuratively, like you think about our phones or whatever, it's just like 1 foot away from us. But even on a on a more metaphorical sense, how much of us are just like, we're just dealing with the things that are just so close right in front of us. And that becomes such in my own life, when my vision is that close, my life feels far more confusing and chaotic. And in his understanding of things, is the importance of myth is that you go from living one foot in front of yourself to you're standing now on a mountaintop. You're broadening your perspective of things, where before you're so limited in what you could see, that myth opens up and shows you that small space that you were in, but how it's fitting in with the rest of things, right? And how that can take us out of a place of confusion. And we talk a lot about calling and purpose, and help us to understand a lot of those things. And I especially think, in our day and age where things are so quick, and it's like where the biggest news story of the day can be about some shit that, earlier that morning. You know what I mean? And it's just like, how fucking close perspective, and then it's just on to the next thing, on to the next thing, on to the next thing. Where are we finding our perspective? Like sometimes it's surprising to me, it's maybe I'm going to need to do like a big social media break one of these days. Not even that I spend a lot of time on it at all, but like all of these sort of videos that people make reacting to just, what this person said, what this person did, like, who fucking cares? Like to such a large extent. It's like, what does that have to do with anything? Right? Where are we going as a culture? What are we trying to, rather than just this sort of reactionary to just like seemingly random events, like where do we find a clear sense of direction there? But it's just, I don't know, there's a kind of frantic madness that strikes me with that kind of engagement with life that seems to be pretty common for so many of us. And why I think that, for me, I know there's this calling. There's this deep calling to a return to these ancestral elements of myth, because I'm not getting any stronger sense of the world and my relationship to the world through people, giving their 2 cents on somebody's fucking TikTok. Like that there's no, it's too close in front of us. It's too short-sighted. It doesn't broaden the perspective of anything. So I don't know. I don't have a good closing thought to finish that one up, but truth, man, truth.
Well, I was thinking about it, as you're talking, I'm like, I think there's a certain element of, we want to be accepted by the tribe, and we want to, acceptance is not something that we always talk about. I think in our culture is like, it's such an important part of the human journey is, and when people are looking, I mean, it's almost embarrassing when you talk about it, it's almost embarrassing when I even talk about the fact that like these things exist. Like you think about it, it's like, what a fucking joke. But like, there is probably a certain element of, we watch people react on like a TikTok or something like that, or, various forms of this. I'm not saying that's your medium, but we care about other people's reactions because it's a cue on how we should think. And so it's like, oh, you see it that way, that helps me guide myself in how I should see it, because I'm looking for cues all the time on, what's acceptable in the tribe and what's weird and what's, and it is very hard to be weird and to be like somebody that doesn't quite get how things work. Like when everybody has a reaction a certain way and you don't see it that way, and then all of a sudden you're the outsider, that can be very hard for us. And we may even be right. We may even be correct in our observation, which is outside, but we tend to conform to the group because there's such a danger and a risk, like in us not being accepted and not being a part of the group. And, I think this is where, good and bad, they play a part, or sometimes we, the group is doing something bad, but we'd rather be accepted by the group than contemplate, is this good or right? Myth has an ability, I think, in some ways to explore some of these things for us, to help us confront some of these things. I think like the hero's journey is such an important part of myth. And the hero can be anybody. And I think that we often think of the hero as like, for example, the lead singer of the band. We think of, the movie star, the CEO, right? We think of the person who's in the leadership position as the hero, but that's not necessarily the hero. And one thing I love about story is I love taking a character that's in a position that shouldn't be a hero and turning them into a hero. The person that's almost the unexpected hero, you could make a story. Just for example, if somebody dared to go do this and they had the interest in it, is a story about the hero being the drummer of the band or the bass player of the band, whereas we culturally think of that person as more of the ensemble. We're like, well, I want to know about the lead singer. And when you think about the people who are making music, you often think about the person singing the lyrics or the lead guitarist maybe, but you don't necessarily think about all the other people that are contributing. And in some times in life, you may have the, let's say, luxury or opportunity, or sometimes it's like more of a negative thing, but you might be the lead singer or the CEO or the leader. And sometimes it seems good, and sometimes it's not good at all to be that position. But it doesn't mean that from your position, you can't be a hero in your journey. And I think what myth does is it sometimes can give us an opportunity to see ourselves as we can be more than we think we are from the position we're in. Whereas we may be pursuing this thing in life, we're going like, once I get here, once I become this person, then I can be a hero in my life. Then I can be this, then I'll be happy, then I'll be whatever. And it's like, well, no, you are where you are right now. And you can tell a story and you can make it captivating if you follow the principles of story and the principles of myth from any character in any position. And stories are endless that way. But if you do the right things, if you bring myth into the story, no matter where the position of the character is or person or whatever, we are willing to go along with you if you honor our time-held traditions of myth, which is that, if they're reluctant, there's implications. If they're unreluctant or whatever, if that's a word, their implications, give them a shadow, give them a flaw, I don't care who they are. I don't care if they're a janitor. I'm willing to go on your mythical journey if you honor these time-true traditions, because I'm after a truth that only myth can tell through this character. And I think that's kind of like, this conversation has been like that for me. It's been like, oh man, fucking, I look out into it. It's just like the vast opportunity of where we could explore this idea. And I go, man, we're only going to get like a bite of it done, and I've kind of made my peace with that as we've gone through this conversation. But dude, it's been fun. I feel like we could go on and on and on. So I'm gonna throw it in and say, let's talk about beer. Let's wrap up our ideas. And you know what? I feel like this is an idea. This is a thread that will probably continue on through future podcast episodes in various forms, in various ways. But yeah, man, it's been a fun journey to even just take a bite out of this idea of myth with you today. So,
I feel like it's probably something that's going to be cropping up from, I don't know for sure, but like I feel like this is one of those things. It's like, no, this is just kind of a now part of my universe now. Like a part of how I'm looking at everything now is through the eyes of myth, or at least trying to see it more that way. And I think that in so many ways, this podcast and our conversations have already incorporated so many of those elements. This just feels kind of like a natural, more direct way to sort of have this conversation. And it seems, it only seems natural. So talking about beer here for a second. So I brought this one in today, and this is from Lighthouse Brewing Company, and this is called the Race Rocks Amber Ale. And it's good. You know, like I sort of bought it. I was sort of attracted to the look of it. If I'll be completely honest, it just kind of had this, I don't know, this very sailory kind of, you know, simple aesthetic to the can and the label. And then, so I just got it, and then I was like, oh, it says like, has like notes of caramel and chocolate. And very often that's kind of like that doesn't always cooperate with me. I sometimes find it's like a little bit too thick sometimes, but this has been really tasty. I've been pleasantly drinking this one the way through this conversation.
I totally agree with you, man. You know, I read that there just now, and I was like, yeah, you know, when I knew nothing about the beer. I just, you know, poured it into my glass and I had a sip, and I was like, this tastes really good. It's really good beer. It's really tasty. Scottish ale. Yeah, chocolate and too much caramel, you know, especially in combination. It's like, you're like, I don't know about that, but they did a good job. Cause to me, with those two elements, they just need to be subtle. And if they're subtle, which this is, to me, that's like, oh, it's a delicious beer. And I didn't really know what I was tasting because I never read anything about the beer before we had it. But I was just like, yeah, it tastes really good. This is really good. It's been really enjoyable. All right, I suppose I'll wrap up since I have the mic in my hand. Oh man. Well, you know, I've been exploring myth and storytelling in particular, and I do think myth probably extends beyond just story. I think there's a certain element that probably that's probably captured in other mediums of art, and I have yet to even filter that through my mind at this point. I'm still trying to, you know, I think what's happened for me in this last week in particular is my appreciation for myth has increased substantially, and my willingness to pay attention to it and look into it has opened up in a way that was never quite as I wasn't able to do before. And once I started to kind of see how these truths almost permeate through our culture and through great mediums of art, and I started looking at other movies and stories and novels and things that I had encountered, I was like, whoa, myth is there, and it's there. And it's like all of a sudden it started jumping off the page, and I was like, it's there, and it's so seamless. That's what makes it so fucking cool. It's like I didn't notice it, and I didn't need to notice it, but now that I do, I'm like, I kind of just appreciate it. And, you know, and I could talk for ages about some of these things, but the two things that I really appreciated this week was something we talked about, which was the reluctant hero and the shadow. And those were two things that I've been working on about 3 stories right now that I've been slowly developing and formulating, and they're coming along fantastic. But this week I was like, hey, let me integrate some of this kind of reluctant hero and shadow element. And man, it binded the stories in a way that was like missing links started just coming together. I was like, holy shit, myth. Like, now that I'm aware of this, I'm like, this is a fucking well. I can just keep going back to this well to like enrich what I'm working on. I'm like, how fucking cool. And then that obviously opened my mind into my own life and how myth plays a part in my own journey, and very cool shit. Just, that's all I got to say. So, you know, to wrap this baby up, I feel like this is the beginning of something that Evan and I will probably be able to talk about more directly. And I think that's really exciting. I do think we've been talking about myth since the beginning of this whole podcast. We just maybe didn't know it. But it is kind of neat to have some of the things that were happening kind of come up and go, oh yeah, that's always kind of been there. And now that I know that, I can embrace it a little bit more because I understand how it plays a part in this whole thing. And I just think it's really cool. I don't have any advice. That's all I got to say.
Coming back to the title of this one, which was your title, you just kind of spat it out there. I was like, I love that. The reality of myth. I just love that whole, that whole little statement, because there seems something about it that seems contradictory, right? Like that doesn't make sense about it. Cause like the reality of myth, like isn't myth something that's not true? Which is interesting because you look up the definition of myth and a lot of places have their first definition of basically saying like it's something that's made up to try and explain natural phenomenon and blah 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 blah, right? It's almost like this is an antiquated thing that we've long since disposed of and no longer need. And it's just like, holy shit, man, do we need myth? Because of the reality that it is speaking to. That's part of, I think, the problem is that a lot of people who take things very literally, if you read a myth literally, you're gonna be walking out pretty empty-handed at the end of the day. You're gonna be pretty nonplussed by your experience of it. But when you dig into them and you start uncovering that, it's like, oh no, this is speaking to a kind of reality of our experience, and how vital that is. Before you were talking about, how we go along with the crowd, it's like, oh, we listen to a lot of people with their comments on, this shit and that shit and whatever. Because yes, there is that part of wanting to be accepted, even though we might have a different view on something. We can be convinced by somebody, not because they've necessarily made a better point, but because we just find ourselves on the outside. And when you said that, I thought, yeah, but he's like, if that was the final word on that, we would be in so much trouble if that was just the final word in that story. Is that like, yep, that's just what it is. We just go along with whatever everyone says all the time. I can't imagine how horrid a society and a world we'd be living in if that were the case. I mean, if you think that the world is, I'm not saying that this is my view, but if you're a person who thinks that the world is just like a shithole now, can't even imagine what it would be like if that were the case. The reason why that's not the case is because of myth. It's because we have stories of people who did the thing that was different from everyone else, who saw something, who had to go somewhere and do something that was not popular, that was not what people from their tribe did, and it was so important and essential that they did. It was because of those stories that throughout time, we found the strength to do those in those kinds of moments. We've been able to look to those stories to draw strength, right? To do those things, to become who we are, even if that's doing something that seems totally, that to the reasonable, logical mind is a totally crazy thing to do. But it was so important that you did the crazy thing, that hero did the crazy thing.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to carry on with this because I love what you're saying. There's another part of myth, which we never talked about, but it's one of those things maybe we'll visit another day. But there's a part of the myth, it's Campbell's idea, but it's return with the elixir, which is a pertinent part of the myth, which is you come back to the tribe with the elixir. You come back with the thing, the knowledge, the wisdom, the experience, and you share that. And if you look at one of the things is, I think we love adventure. I think there's a certain element of us which we all respect the adventurer, even if we don't agree with them or understand them in the beginning. When they come back with the elixir, we understand their journey, and there's a certain amount of respect the adventurer gets, which is that I didn't support you on your way off from the tribe, and I didn't want you to go because I would miss you, and I didn't want you to leave, and I wanted you to be here and all of this, but you came back with an insight and a knowledge, and you shared that with us, and bless you for going off and finding this and bringing this back to us, which has all made us better. And had you not been strong enough to go against what was safe and convenient and comfortable and agreed upon, we would have never had the chance to overcome this, this thing. And so there is a part of the hero's journey and the myth of the hero's journey, which is that, yes, you go off on this hard and challenging adventure that's going to push you through the dark night of the soul and face your shadow. But there's like, there's a promise of return. And I think that's part of the reason why you go. And then you return, they call it return with the elixir kind of idea. And it's like, yes, you come back with something, some wisdom, some idea. And when you come back home, not only are you transformed, but what you're transformed with helps transform everyone else. And those make our teachers and mentors and things like that, right? And it's why we look up to them, because they were once the adventurer, and the story didn't end with them just conforming.
And again, why it's so important for us to come back to these stories, whether they're old ones or they're modern retellings of these stories, but again, not putting superficial, transplanting superficial agendas on top of them, but actually communicating the deep, 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 deep things that they're communicating, and remembering those things, because they are so essential. And they also bring a creative element to our lives as well, because they are very, and not creative necessarily in the sense of, being a creative person and, making art, but being a creative human being, which is being a participant in life and with others, being a member of your community, building in whatever way you build, like that's a creative life, right? Bringing light, bringing light, healing, whatever it is, into your community is a creative life. And myth is teaching us about how we do that, right? In so many regards, it's teaching us and telling us ways in which we can do that, which is just another reason why it's so essential, why we remember these. I think I had some other point, but to that effect, I had something, and then I was thinking of, as you were talking, I was reminded of a terrific book called Care of the Soul by Thomas More. And he's a big lover of myth himself. And, one of the things about, going to the classic ones especially is because I think classic myths, because they connect us to our ancient human lineage, there's something very powerful about that. And if we can learn to look at our own lives in a mythic sense, which I think is part of the problem. It's not just like, oh, that was a good story. It's because of how intimate these stories are with who we are, that those myths help us to look more creatively and mythically at our own lives. And there's something so much more enjoyable about that too. You know, like because of how rational and literal we often look at things in our life. You know, it's like I'm just thinking even for myself, you know, I've recently been feeling a little bit like, oh man, you know, like this sort of, what am I, it's like, what am I doing with my life right now? Like, it's like I'm feeling, you know, just like I'm not doing anything or going anywhere. I'm feeling stagnant, blah, 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 blah. And just what if I thought about my life more mythically, in the sense of like, well, what? And it's like, yeah, I'm a little lost at sea right now. You know, like there's this poeticism that myth can help us see our own lives in, rather than just putting this sort of cold literal language to our things. It's like, well, what if you're just a little lost at sea, you know, and just reminded that like, hey, your life is poetry. You know, don't think that these are just things in the stories. Those stories are about you. These stories are about you. And we could be well served to look at our lives in the same mythic ways.
Thank you for listening in on our conversation today. We hope you found something helpful that you can carry forward with you. Head over to our website, wayoftheartist.com, for more free exclusive material and learn about the show. If you haven't already, please support us by subscribing to the show, sharing it with people you know, and keeping compassionate, creative conversation going.